This is by Bernice Abbott. It's an image taken from the top of the Chrysler building, looking down on buildings in Manhattan, and clearly taken at night. It's an unusual image, as with the Alvin Langdon Coburn image that we saw earlier. There is no horizon. We are looking down on the buildings. There's no attempt to correct perspective, and it's a wonderful image of architecture made in the mid-1930s. And as I mentioned before, Bernice Abbott was the person most responsible for salvaging a lot of the work of Eugene Ache, and also for bringing his images to the United States. And while she was looking down in the picture that we saw just now, here she is looking up. So the constraints of architectural photography generally are not of any interest to her. And converging lines, well, that's what happens. This is Brooklyn. The building's still there, by the way. And I love the gesture of the various opened doorways. I guess that's what you'd call them. And not only was Abbott a fan of the work of Eugene Ache, but she also learned a great deal from him, and was as intent on documenting primarily the environment of New York City as he was, but also stylistically there are common threads. And the idea of this bridge in the background, in the soft, hazy light, in contrast to the darker buildings in the foreground, is something you might find in an Ache. Again, a very straightforward style. And there's no manipulation except for point of view, which is always manipulative. Something I should probably have mentioned when I was talking about Ache, when Gary Winogrand, one of the great photographers of the last part of the 20th century, when he was asked what made Ache great, he thought about it for a minute and said he knew where to stand. And that's pretty much photography in a nutshell. And most great photographs are ones in which the photographer knew where to stand. And here we have Bernice Abbott's take on the Flatiron building, which still tends to attract photographers. It's a remarkable building. But in this one, it's obviously taken from several stories up. It looks like it's maybe the 6th or 7th floor of a building across the square from the Flatiron building. And being up high, the vehicles and pedestrians all become much smaller, less seemingly important, less monumental than when photographing from the ground. This is by Charles Sheeler, who was also a painter, and but he was very drawn to industrial subject matter. This is looking up into a stairwell. This is the River Rouge plant in Detroit, which at the time was the largest factory in the world. I believe the production line was said to have been a mile long. And truly extraordinary subject matter. But Sheeler's made the most of it. This is by Ralph Steiner. And a very simple picture, not a lot of elements, but there's something very complex about the results from the angle of the column on the right and the angle that we're seeing the rocking chair from, the dark area on the left, the shutter next to the window, but most importantly the fractured shadow of the chair on the wall. And all come together in this wonderful image. This is by Ansel Adams, who isn't usually thought of as being particularly an architectural photographer, but this is Moonrise over Hernandez, and it's an image that he apparently almost didn't get, and he had to stop the car and get out and put his camera on the roof of the truck and make his exposure within less than 2 minutes, or so the story goes. And his son, who was with him at the time, asked him why he didn't make a second exposure, and he said, well, it had all changed by then. Especially when you're working at first light and last light of the day, conditions are changing so quickly that the difference of a minute can be monumental. But this is, I think, one of Adams's greatest pictures. It's certainly one that he made more prints of than any other. From what I understand, almost 1,000 of them. And it's of this little town with extraordinary clouds and the moon in the background and the mountains. And at just the right time. This is unusual, and it's the only image that I know of. I'm sure there are others, but it's the only one that I know of by Adams taken in New York City. And here we have subject matter that would seem to be definitely his turf with subject matter that's not at all his turf usually. But here he seems to be right at home, and a really nice juxtaposition of the rocks in the foreground with the building in the background, with a nice tree in between. This is by Dorothea Lange, who was also, along with Walker Evans, one of the photographers who was hired by the WPA to document America during the Depression. And she didn't spend nearly as much time as Evans did looking at the architecture. She was much more interested in the people. But this is a pretty nice image. This is by Margaret Bourke-White. And Margaret Bourke-White was primarily a photojournalist. She worked for Life magazine and other magazines of the time. This was made in the 30s of the Chrysler building. And a view of it that we don't normally see, but certainly is pretty instantly recognizable. And she was always looking for ways to show something that was not usually seen. So here we have the Hotel Cleveland with looking through a gate in the foreground. And here's a bridge, very much in her way. It fits within her style, definitely. And this is by her as well. It's the first cover of Life magazine. You can see in 1936. And it's of the Fort Peck Dam. I think that's in Montana. And is obviously monumental. However, it wouldn't be as convincingly monumental if you took the two gentlemen out of the picture in the foreground. So I'm sure they were there at her request. This is by Andreas Feininger, who was an expatriate from Europe, came to the United States in the late 30s, and I think in particular he had been involved with Bauhaus. I think this is a particularly interesting image with the graveyard in the foreground and some very unusual buildings in the background in New York. This is also Feininger of the Brooklyn Bridge. It's great to see the bridge so plainly, graphically presented against the skyline, which has all kind of been rendered gray by atmosphere. This is by Viagra Weston, who was a California photographer and didn't photograph a lot of architecture, but when he did, again with his own style, he was a very influential photographer, more though for the objects that he photographed and his nudes. Most people know him from his series on peppers and the chambered nautilus. But he was definitely a modernist. His point of view was idiosyncratic. His feeling was that if someone else had already done it, there was certainly no point in his doing it. So if he couldn't see something that was that he could do his own, take his own approach with, then there was really no point in taking the picture. And this is also Evans. As is this. A very simple composition, simple subject matter, beautifully rendered. The shadows, the various lines, just making a wonderful image.